It turns out that the way we relate to others as adults is rooted in the attachments we had with our caregivers as children. In this conversation, I'm talking to Dr. Ron Frederick, the author of Loving Like You Mean It, about how we can understand the attachment we had as children and then reprogram that with emotional mindfulness if it's not serving us well today. Welcome to Happiness Adventure. I'm Lisa, and together we'll explore ways to cultivate real joy in our lives. Well, for those of us who aren't really familiar with therapy and psychotherapy and don't know the difference between the different types, how would you explain it in layman's term? What are kind of the tenets of what you talk about doing so that we can heal?
So therapy, in fact, was referred to as the talking cure. Okay? And a lot of people's experience in therapy, or perhaps maybe what they imagine therapy is like, is that they would go and talk to someone else. And through the talking, something's going to change, something's going to shift. Now, there's an aspect of that that's true. But what we have found, and when I say we, I'm talking more about the field of psychology and neuropsychology and what we understand about the brain and trauma and how we heal through experience. What does that mean? Well, an embodied experience is one in which we're present with what's inside. Okay. And that is more of a right brain experience. So right brain, emotions, sensations, images, and then the left brain brings in talking, logic, linear thinking, thinking things through. Well, ultimately, we need an integration. But the reason why talk therapy, so to speak, if we just stay on that level, has limited effectiveness is because we're not reaching into our feelings and reaching into the emotional part of our brain. So what's different about the work that I do and the work that other experiential therapists do, so experiential meaning experience, is that we work with a focus on emotion, the body, having an embodied experience. And what's necessary for us to be able to do that is to be with someone else who we feel is also with us, supporting us, and we're not alone with the experience. So then, as we open up to a fuller experience of ourselves, what is an innate healing process can take over.
I think that what you're saying is that if we have some kind of pain or emotional memory in us,
right,
talking about it or intellectualizing about it all day long isn't going to let us re-access it and kind of clean it out. That's just going to keep it in the left brain instead of where we need to change, which is back in the emotions.
Right, totally, you got it. And this is why we say these things all the time. You know, I know I shouldn't be afraid of this, or I know it really wasn't my fault, or, you know I was just a kid, but yet I still feel afraid, or yet I still feel ashamed, or that's the separation between right and left brain. Well, the stuff in the right brain has to get processed so that it can link up with the left brain, and then we can feel with truth those awarenesses, those realizations. I was just a kid, or it wasn't my fault, or whatever the case may be. Now, the other piece that's so important, and is what I talk about in my new book, Loving Like You Mean It, is that our early experiences in life that are so formidable and really shape us are stored in our implicit memory. And that's the part of our memory that is unconscious. So really all of our relational software, which I'm talking about particularly these days and in this book, is stuff that's unconscious. And we just do relationships the way we were wired to do them. And that's really where we get into trouble. Those of us who had less than optimal early emotional relational experiences didn't get the best software when it comes to having relationships. So in order to be able to learn to steer our ship differently, we need to become more mindful of what's happening inside of us, right? And that's tuning into what's felt, what's happening in our nervous system. And that's fed by the implicit memory, right? So if we don't pay attention to it, if we don't get out of our thinking and pay attention to what's happening inside of us, we're not going to be able to make the kind of changes that we need to make in order to have better relationships, in order to heal. So we think about it as a bottom-up process, bottom being in our body and then making sense of it in our head, versus the top-down experience, which is really what talk therapy could be, which is I'm trying to enforce an understanding on my nervous system and get it to change.
Yeah. I would really love to understand a little bit more about how do we get programmed when we're kids, and what does attachment mean, and so that we can have a lot of compassion for ourselves and however we're kind of maybe trying to connect with people in a way that's not productive now, and kind of understanding how our roots might have affected that.
So when we're born, when we're newborns, our brains are really basically like a lump of clay. So we come into the world ready to go in as much as we have the hardware, but we don't have a lot of programming. So if you think of the brain like a computer, there's not a lot of programming there, but there's everything there is ready to go. The neurons are there, ready to be stimulated. And the ways in which we get programmed, so to speak, is through interaction, is through experience. And the experiences that we have, in particular with our caregivers, because think about it, when you're a newborn, who's there? This is your whole world, right? The other, your mother, father, or whatever the case may be, your caregiver. And it's through this interaction between infant and caregiver that baby's brain starts to light up, and the neurons start to light up, and they start to fire, and neurons that fire wire together, and then these patterns start to form. And that's really learning. That's what's happening. And the learning is getting programmed into our brain. Now, we're learning everything about emotion, about ourselves, about relationships. We come into the world with one imperative, and that is to connect with our primary caregivers. Why? If we didn't, we would perish. That's how it goes for humans. And if we stop and look at it, it makes sense. We're incredibly dependent. If we weren't taken care of, if we weren't sheltered, if we don't feel safely connected, that's what attachment is, to be attached, to feel safely connected. That is threatening to a child. So we come into the world with that need. So emotion is the basis of connection. What do I mean by that? It's about emotional responsivity. Are you there? Are you reliably there for me? And if I'm in distress, if there's something wrong, are you going to be there? Now, we start to learn about this very early on. Can we rely on our primary caregivers to be there for us? Are they going to be emotionally attuned? Are they going to understand who we are? And we also are learning about ourselves. How am I perceived? Am I lovable? How is the other perceived? How do I perceive the other? What are they like? Can I trust them? Can I trust that they're going to be there for me? And now we're not talking about necessarily trauma or traumatic experiences. Those are important as well. We're talking about emotional responsivity. Now, I grew up in a family where, in some ways, both of my parents were anxious around feelings. right? And I'm picking up on this. And as an infant, I'm learning like what's okay, what's not okay. It wasn't okay to be angry. That was threatening in some way. That's getting wired in, right? Now, all of our feelings serve a positive, constructive purpose for us. But if we're having the experience where it seems like my being exuberant or happy makes the other nervous, and I then, in my attempt to maintain a safe connection with you, start to suppress some of those feelings, that's adaptive because it helps me maintain a connection. But I start to lose those feelings as resources in my life. When we're talking about parenting, we're not talking about perfection. We're going to have moments where we're not there. We're going to have, as a parent, we're going to have moments where we lose it or whatever. But does it get repaired? That's one of the most important lessons that we can impart, that a parent can impart, which is even if things get bumpy, it gets repaired. Mm-hmm. So that in our experience then, we can feel safe or confident that even if there's anger or there's disruption or there's tension, that we're going to get to a better place. When things go well and we have parents who are emotionally mindful, emotionally competent, that is, they can be present with their feelings, they can deal with them, they can deal with you and your feelings. They're, for the most part, reliably there when we need them in helpful ways, and they're attuned. It doesn't mean they're perfect. It means that they stay in the game and they work things through. And, does the parent soothe the child if they're distressed? Whether that's physically, hand on the back, the voice, the tone of voice that we have. It's being attuned to, when there's fear, when there's upset. Being clear about your own feelings as a parent, like what it's bringing up for you, but also being able to imagine and empathize with what's going on for the child. There's fear, so how do we manage that? I'll be with you. Let's go together. I'll hold your hand, right? So the child must still be afraid, but you're helping them by being there with them, and they're not alone with the fear, and then they start to feel a little more stable or a little less fearful, and then they do their thing. And that's what secure attachment does. Like, it sets up this awareness and a foundation where we know we feel secure, and then we're willing to explore more. And that's what happens with a child. They're looking to see, are you there? Are you paying attention? And then they take a few more steps. And then they take a few more steps. And that's all about growth. That's healthy dependency. That's healthy attachment, because healthy attachment breeds security, which means then we also feel safe and confident in the world to learn about the world and venture out and be a part of the world. And that will connect with others as well. The rest of us, which is also a sizable amount, don't have experiences quite like that. So we may have had a caregiver who has their own anxiety or discomfort around feelings, their own attachment experiences that affect them in terms of security. Maybe a parent has depression or anxiety or, other things going on. Maybe there's other things like alcoholism or other kinds of problems that will impinge on a person's experience. So what we find then is that a fair amount of us have what we would call an insecure attachment style. So, and there are three categories of insecure attachment. So the first one I'll talk about is avoidant. And this is a child who has a caregiver who in some way is dismissive or uncomfortable around their needs for connection. And for instance, I had a client years ago who told me the story, a memory that he had of being a little boy and playing outside and coming inside and feeling all exuberant, and mom was in the kitchen and he went to give his mother a kiss and his mother pulled back and said, "Don't be silly."
Aw.
Okay. So yeah, you have an emotional response to that, right? Because
Yeah.
we see that as the love and exuberance and care of a child, but mom was having her own experience for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
right? Closeness or maybe that kind of show of affection felt uncomfortable for her. I don't, we didn't mean she didn't love her child, but this is what came up for her. This is what he experiences with it, sort of dismissive. So what happens when, we're dismissed or we're disparaged for having these feelings? We want to avoid that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what do? What does the child do? Now, these are not conscious strategies. Okay? It happens just sort of organically. We start to avoid things. So I'm not going to be outwardly reach out to someone. I'm not going to freely show my feelings, because if I do, I know that that's going to end up I'll be feeling pain. So
Yeah.
someone who develops an avoidant attachment style deactivates their feelings and deactivates their needs for connection. It doesn't mean they don't have feelings. It doesn't mean that they don't have needs for connection, because we all do, but they learn to suppress them. And they become an adult who has a hard time with closeness, is not so emotionally expressive,
Mm-hmm.
can be more distant, harder to reach. And that's one adaptation to an insecure attachment experience. Another adaptation is what we would call anxious or anxious ambivalent. Now, this is a child who had a parent who was sometimes there and sometimes not. So sometimes could come through and sometimes could be attuned. And then other times, maybe they're overwhelmed with their own anxiety. Maybe, for whatever reasons, they're distracted, they're not attuned. So child learns that they can't quite rely on that, right? Are you going to be there or are you not? Like, I don't feel a consistent sense of security. And this child becomes more hypervigilant. And are you going to be there? And is very attuned to the parent and less attuned to our own emotional experience. And so much is based on, is the parent okay? And if the parent's okay, then I'm safe. But the thing with an anxious ambivalent attachment style is what can also happen is that the child has to work hard in a way and find other ways beyond what would be just sort of within the normal range of getting the caregiver to respond. So they may end up relying on behaviors that we might say are negative, like being irritated or upset or having to get louder, to get the person involved. And so if we've had that experience, we grow into adults who feel insecure in our relationships, not always confident that the other person's going to be there. We're not as aware of what's going on inside of us because we're very attuned to what's going on in the other. We may worry a lot. Our thoughts about the relationship can take up a lot of space, our emotional real estate. And we don't necessarily show our vulnerability easily, but we might complain, or we might, be upset with the other person because they're not showing up for us in some way. So the other one is fearful avoidant. And this is, when we're threatened in some way. So when we feel in danger as a child, we want to reach out to our caregivers because they're the older, stronger, wiser. They should be our safe haven. So if we're distressed, that's what happens. Now, for some of us, that distress that we're experiencing, our caregiver or parent may be the source of that distress. So this child really is faced with a dilemma, which is, I am frightened and I need safety, but the very person who should be able to seek safety from is actually frightening to me as well. Now, what does that mean? Well, they may be behaving in a way that's scary. Maybe, they're abusive in some way, or maybe they're overwhelmed and it's scary to you, or maybe, like I said, I mentioned alcoholism, so to use that as an example, they're behaving in ways that is scary to a child, right? So the child is faced with this dilemma, which is, I have needs and I'm afraid, and yet I don't feel like I can reach out to you. So it's really this dilemma. It's fright without solution. Everything sort of falls apart internally. And so we have this push-pull thing going on, and it leaves someone feeling overwhelmed, and this concomitant experience of having a longing for connection, but also being afraid of it. So we grow into adults who both long for connection and feel like we have this hole inside of us that can't be filled. But when someone starts to get close to us, we may lash out. And it's a way of avoiding the danger and pushing them away. So there ends up being a lot of this back and forth in a way that can be chaotic and feel out of control.
Your hopeful message is that we can access our software, like we spoke about, and reprogram it. So how do we do that?
So what I talk about in Loving Like You Mean It is that's what in large part the book is about. So we cover this stuff that you and I were talking about in much more depth to give us an understanding of what it is we're dealing with, how we're put together, and to get some insight into how we were shaped by our early experience. But then what we're looking at really is the here and now. So how is this stuff showing up for us in our relationships? And I lay out a 4-step process, which is all about developing emotional mindfulness. So what's emotional mindfulness? Emotional mindfulness is what we would have developed if we had a secure attachment experience. And basically what we're talking about is being aware of, attuned to our emotional experience, what's happening for us, and being able to be present with it and make good use of it, to both participate in our experience and also observe it. So we call it participatory observation. So you're both feeling what's happening for you, and you also can observe it. So when we can feel it and be present to it and also observe it, then we're finding this balance and that allows us to be able to have choices about how we want to respond. And that's really where freedom lies. This is what we want in a relationship, which is to be aware of and in touch with our feelings and to be able to be present with them, but also able to observe and have some room so that we can navigate them and make healthier choices in the ways in which we're navigating them. Emotional mindfulness is really mindfulness with a particular emphasis on our emotional experience. All the wiring, all the things that I'm talking about, the software, that shows up in our emotional experience. So key to us having a different relational experience is developing our relationship with our emotional selves. As we develop our relationship with our emotional selves, we can have better relationships with others. Okay. So the 4 steps of my process that I talk about in Loving Like You Mean It, that all have to do with developing emotional mindfulness in relationship. We start with step 1, and that is recognize and name. So this is about recognizing when our old wiring, our software is getting triggered and being able to name it. Am I feeling sad? Am I feeling angry? What's getting activated? Is there a young part of me, that's feeling vulnerable? All these different things and ways we can approach it. Then when we recognize that it's there, we pay attention to it. The second step is stop, drop, and stay. And that's about stopping, right? So when our wiring gets triggered, we go from stimulus to response. Usually it's like this. It's triggered and boom, you have a response, right? What we're trying to do is stretch this space.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a stimulus, you get triggered, and then we're trying to stretch the space so that when we get to responding, we're going to do something different, and it's going to be better for us and for our partners and for our relationship. So we recognize in the first step, and the second step is to stop, drop, and stay. So that's about going inside and spending a little time with what's happening for us emotionally. So we have to be able to calm our nervous system down some, and then get in touch with what are the feelings, what's actually getting stimulated for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be easier said than done in a way. It may be more complicated. It may take time. There may be things that we have to sort out. That's okay. This is a living, breathing process. It happens over time. So we work in the second step to get clarity and presence around our feelings, which is actually, I realized I wasn't really angry, but I was feeling anxious, or I was feeling nervous, or I was feeling afraid, or I was feeling vulnerable. It's usually the softer feelings that are harder for us to share, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about getting clarity. But really, the second step is about connecting with what's underneath. The third step is to pause and reflect. This is probably more about the clarity, because we're then pausing and reflecting. What did I just learn? What was happening for me? Beyond what the feeling may be, it speaks to my needs and my wants and my desires and what I want in relationship. But it also speaks to, understanding who I am and how I'm wired and how this fits into a bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
And when we reflect, we step back and we reflect, that helps to flesh out our story and our understanding of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, and also points the direction, can point us in a direction of what's going to be helpful for us to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then we take the next step, which is mindfully relate. So that is to then take what we've learned and work with it in our relationship in a mindful way. So what does that mean? That means regulating ourselves, being aware of when we're getting activated, attuning to our partners, trying to be empathic in terms of what they're experiencing, noticing when they're getting defensive, notice when I'm getting defensive. It's a lot to sort of navigate.
Yeah.
But all of these things, we can break it down into steps and work on the skills, so to speak, that are required to be able to do them more effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can work on these things and do work on these things over time. And the steps aren't necessarily linear. And we may spend a lot of time stopping and dropping and going inside and figuring out what's going on, or reflecting on how we want to proceed. Or it may happen right in the moment where there's a stimulus. I feel something inside of me. I go, I'm being reactive. I take a breath and I go, that is making me angry. And I realize exactly what it is. And I reflect for a moment on how best to communicate this.
Uh-huh.
And then I mindfully, share it with my partner.
Well, and then I guess what you're saying is also that becomes easier over time as the software updates.
Right, because the more we work, the more that we practice these capacities, the stronger we get.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I say this in my book, it's not like people with a secure attachment style have superhuman powers. We all have the capacity for these things. But they need our attention in order for them to grow, and they need our willingness, and our willingness to risk, because it feels scary, because that's what our old software is telling us. It's dangerous. Don't go there.
Yeah.
But the more that we do that, and this is why people have meditation practices, right?
Uh-huh.
What we're talking about here is bringing those practices into our relationship. And we're the person we bring into our relationship, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes we want our partner, if you would just do these things differently, everything would be better. And I'm not saying that they're not responsible. They are responsible for their part. But we are also need to be and take responsibility for steering our own ship, because the better we are at doing that, the better things can go with our partners. And that's what I'm talking about in my book, which is I want to help people to be able to move in a direction where they can have new experiences and do it in a way that it doesn't have to feel so overwhelming, and that it's possible and you can have success, and success breeds more success.
I have one more question for you that we ask everyone.
Okay.
And that is, what are you doing right now to cultivate joy in your life?
As you can imagine, working on this book, I spent a whole lot of time in sort of production mode, which is having to produce, right? And writing is not something that I find particularly easy. And I am trying to slow down and find joy in this, the quieter, smaller moments.